Yo, 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 I'm back to do another review after a long time in the dark. Cool darkness. It is pretty dark, this review, actually. Franz Kafka, collected stories. Not really a book, very difficult to review. It's basically his whole career, other than the 3 novels. Don't even need to list those because I'm sure you know what they are. And his whole career is difficult to review, but I'll give it a go. The first thing I need to say about this collection is I think it proves the value of judging your own work. Franz Kafka is an excellent judge of his own work, probably a lot more than the publishers. I suppose I was the one who bought his collected stories, warts and all, that would imply. But I think it just goes to show Kafka knew what his works, which of his works were good. Sorry, that was a slight blip there. Kafka knew which of his works were good, which to publish, and the published during Kafka's lifetime section is phenomenal. I think possibly if it was on its own, I would have given it 5 stars, or maybe a very high 4. But with the other ones, it just scrapes for 3 border, because the stories Kafka didn't publish, he didn't publish them for a reason. They're just not as good. Nothing there. There isn't really any exceptions. There are some that are better than others, but none of them reach the heights of the ones Kafka actually published in his lifetime. So pay heed to that when you're reading this collection. Don't expect there to be some hidden gem. Don't expect you thinking, oh, why didn't Kafka publish that? He should have done it. It's great. Because I disagree if you have that thought. As I've said before, Kafka in his top game is amazing. Right from the beginning, he just has this style of condensing intellectual and very visceral concepts into a very short space. Flash fictions, basically, are most of his stories in his early period. And everyone says, oh, flash fictions are this new thing, but they're really not. Kafka and I think Ernest Hemingway as well were doing them almost 100 years ago, and probably over 100 years ago, because Kafka's first collection, Meditations, came out over 100 years ago. I think those probably are the best aspects of his collection. His longer stories are more famous, probably because they're longer and more people read longer stories. And there are some very good long stories, but there's something about his flash fictions which just really affect me quite significantly. Meditations, the first one, not quite as good as some of his latest collections, but it does lay the groundwork for his style. Possibly my favourite one in that collection is Unmasking a Confidence Trickster, which isn't so much about confidence trickster as you would think of the term, but more a larger metaphor for just people in general who kind of hide behind veils. Although, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it's a metaphor for. That's the good thing about, I think, most of this collection, is that you think you know what it's about, but you're not really sure. He's always transparent enough to be good, but ambiguous enough to keep you thinking about it. That's the perfect balance. That's probably why he's endured so much, I think. You probably want me to talk a little bit about the Metamorphosis, because it's Kafka's most famous story, and I will give you some information. It was probably the saddest story in the collection, because even though Gregor Samsa doesn't actually express that much emotion in his narration, it's so fucking tragic. His entire life deteriorates around him. His family hate him. He's losing all physical ability to do anything. He's just a thing in a room. I'd say, yeah, it is very tragic. There's not that much more to say about it, though. It's not as intellectually or emotionally deep or vigorously interesting as most of the stories in the first half of the collection. It's nowhere near his worst at all, but it's probably slightly overrated. He's done a lot better in his life, I'd say. Most people, well, a lot of people say that his best story is in the Penal Colony. And while I think there are some better ones in this collection, it's definitely the best over 10-page story. Because as I've said, I think his parables and epigrams and that kind of really short flash fiction are probably the best ones. In the Penal Colony is incredibly original. It is definitely a lot more unique than the Metamorphosis. Those kind of themes of loneliness and alienation have been done by other writers. I mean, I'd still say it's quite an original story, but in the Penal Colony, I've never read anything like it. It is a religious satire, I think, but it's incredibly serious. It's not a comedic satire. Can you get serious satires? If you can, it's definitely one of those. But as well as being stronger in originality than the Metamorphosis, I think it's also much stronger in intellectual value. It's got more metaphorical connotations. The insect is quite an in-your-face metaphor, but there's a lot more depth to all the metaphors in the Penal Colony. The characterization as well. None of the characters have any names, but they're very well fleshed out characters, especially the officer, almost a messiah-like figure for the dying thought processes of, in my opinion, the Old Testament values of crime and punishment. I think it kind of represents the clashing of the dying out of hard crime and punishment, conservative Old Testament values, and the more forgiving values of Christ. Although it doesn't really touch on the hypocrisy of those values. Although maybe Kafka didn't think that, I don't know. But even without any of these intellectual or metaphorical kind of allusions and deep meanings, it's a really interesting story. I think even if you weren't trying to see it as a metaphor for anything, you would really enjoy it, because it's got a lot of blood and gore. And, I mean, it is basically just one long 30-page conversation between two people, but in the best way possible. Definitely the best long-form story in this collection. The height of Kafka's career has to come with the collection A Country Doctor. A Country Doctor has kind of the same makeup as Meditations, with lots of short parables, some slightly longer parables, but they're all under 10 pages, apart from the Report of the Academy, actually, which is slightly overrated, but interesting story. I remember it most from it being constantly quoted in a book called We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves by Karen Joy Fowler. Great book, probably better than the story in Report from Academy, but that's not the best one here. The title story, A Country Doctor, is probably my favourite Kafka story of all time. It's so surreal and just, it's a punch in the face. I don't really understand what's going on, to be honest, but it's incredibly macabre as well. Okay, I'm just kind of getting adjectives out of the air. I probably should have made a script for this review. But if you want a surreal roller coaster of a story with some macabre elements, it's probably the most intense version of that kind of thing. Obviously, a lot of Kafka stories can be described like that, but this is the purest distillation of those qualities. Then the story kind of veers off in two separate directions. There's the really visceral, violent ones, like the old manuscript, which is about some kind of culture clash. It's quite unclear about what culture, but apart from a mention of the emperor, presumably the Chinese emperor, because he's mentioned in other bits of the collection. Then there's the more psychologically dark ones. I really like An Imperial Message, which is about a man who tries to give a message to someone, but the palace of Peking, the Chinese capital before it was Beijing, is so vast that it takes thousands of years even to get out of the palace, and in that time the messenger will have died, the emperor will have died, and there'll be really no point in the person getting the message because they probably will have died as well. Um, I quite like that. That's basically another story, which is basically the definition of Kafkaesque. Um, it was included in the longer story, The Great Wall of China, which is probably more famous. But I think The Great Wall of China as a whole is a bit shite, whereas An Imperial Message is one of Kafka's best stories. So I think people should just listen to Kafka because he knows which bits of his work work, if that makes sense. Whereas the critics don't so much, because although it's a bit presumptuous of me to assume I know better than the critics what Kafka's stories are good, but obviously I agree with Kafka more on his stories than the critics do, so fuck you, critics. The rest of the posthumous stories are a little better. I quite liked some of them, like Investigations of a Dog is a great kind of exploration, psychology of dogs, basically. I'm not entirely sure if it's a metaphor for something else, but it's kind of the contrast between how obvious the things the dog is missing, things that we humans would just take for granted because he's a dog, but how it's written like he's some kind of PhD doing a scientific exploration. I think that's the point. That's quite a good contrast. But even those, like Investigations of Dogs, is one of the best in this part collection. Even those, they just lack a certain verve of creativity that Kafka's stories that he actually published have. And I feel like maybe they would have been better not seeing the light of day, almost all of them, even the better ones. Although, as I've said previously, I was the one who bought the collected stories, so I kind of shot myself in the foot a bit there. And they're always going to publish, a great writer like Kafka, they're always going to publish stuff he didn't publish because money. It's not a complete train wreck. I mean, there is some very interesting stories here. Like, for example, Blumfeld, An Elderly Bachelor. I didn't particularly enjoy reading it because it was kind of such an unpleasant idea. It just kind of got into my brain. But it wasn't that underwhelming. It's about this old man who gets followed around by sentient balls. Not ball sack balls. Just kind of toy, round, proper, nice, shiny balls. And they kind of bounce around and are incredibly irritating towards him. And then the story just kind of cuts off without really telling you whether he managed to successfully get rid of the balls or whether they came back to haunt him once again. But overall, it was very disappointing, the second section. I would recommend Kafka, I think, as a short story writer. I've never read any of his novels, and I probably will at some point, because a lot of his short stories are fabulous and fantastic. I would recommend him because the first half of the book, phenomenal. So many great stories there. Second half, very disappointing, lacked a lot of verve, but still had some very interesting concepts and probably worth a read. Maybe I would have enjoyed it more if I hadn't been lowered in my expectations by the first half. I mean, higher than my expectations, therefore they were lower when the results came in. Yeah, I fucked up a bit there, but ignore that. Yeah, so I'm going to give this collection a C, actually, I think. A C. Not great, I suppose, but the bad stuff weighs down the good stuff, honestly, and it's not that consistent. But it's worth it, so I'm not going to endorse you buy it because I'm not some kind of Amazon dog's body who worships capitalism. Although I'm not a communist either, so you can buy it if you want. I've gone a bit of a tangent. Anyway, I recommend it. That was my point. Thank you.